story of how plants reproduce is one of the most wonderful stories in nature. It is a story which we cannot fully explain. It is the story of life itself. Life endlessly repeated, season after season. During the springtime, the warm days of summer, plant after plant displays its blossoms and goes on to produce fruits and seeds. Most of the plants we are familiar with have several main parts. There are the roots, which anchor the plant in the soil and absorb the moisture and minerals necessary for its growth. Another main part of the plant is the stem, which supports the leaves, flowers, and later the fruit. The leaf of the plant is the part that manufactures food, using chlorophyll and sunlight to combine carbon dioxide and water into food materials. The flower is the part of the plant that we usually think of in terms of its beauty, but like the roots, the leaves, and the stem, it has an important part to play. The flower is the part that makes it possible for many plants to reproduce. If the flower is successful, the plant will provide for new plants. The beauty and fragrance of flowers are important, but not just because we enjoy them. Color and fragrance help the flower and therefore help the plant it grows on. Let's examine some familiar garden flowers to see what the parts of a flower are and what each of them does. Before most flowers open, they are protected by green, leaf-like parts called sepals. The sepals unfold when the flower is ready to bloom. At the base of this flower, you can see sepals which have opened to form a circle around the blossom. Inside the sepals is a second circle of parts called petals. The petals are the showy part of the flower, usually colored. Within the petals is another circle of parts called stamens, sometimes harder to see than the petals, but very important to the flower. If you touch the stamens, you will find them covered with a yellow powdery dust called pollen. Greatly enlarged, a stamen looks like this. It has a tiny stalk called a filament, topped off with a knob-like end, the anther. The anther holds the pollen grains. In the very center of the blossom is the fourth important part of the flower, the pistil. A pistil looks something like a tiny vase with the larger part at the bottom containing the ovules, a slender neck, and a sticky top called the stigma. Now that we know the names of the four parts of a flower, let's look at their locations once again. There are sepals, the colorful petals, stamens, and the pistil. Have you ever walked in an orchard when the apple trees were in bloom? If you have, you know that the trees with their masses of delicate flowers are an attractive sight. Attractive to bees as well as ourselves. Hundreds of them buzz about gathering nectar, their bodies dusty with pollen. Bees are attracted to flowers by the fragrance. As bees gather nectar, they help the flower in a very important way. For before a flower can form a seed, pollen must be transferred from the stamen to the pistil. Sometimes the pollen is carried by a bee or other insect. Sometimes it is carried by the wind, and sometimes it simply falls. Greatly enlarged, this is how pollen looks. As you can see, pollen grains from different flowers have different shapes. Bees usually go from one flower to another of the same kind, so the pollen that rubs off the bee is the right kind of pollen for that flower. When pollen is carried to the pistil, either by the wind or by a bee, each grain begins to grow, sending down a tiny tube toward the ovules within the bulb-like base of the pistil. The first pollen tube to meet the ovule joins with it in a process called fertilization to form a new cell. The success of the flower depends upon that moment of fertilization. Without it, the flower fades, useless to the plant. Of course, after fertilization, the petals are no longer needed and they drop off. But part of a fertilized flower remains. Inside, the part that remains is the single cell that was formed by fertilization. It begins to grow. It divides into two cells. These cells grow and divide over and over until there are many cells which take shape into a seed within a fruit. For every fruit, there was once a blossom that was fertilized, and so every fruit is the result of a flower that completed its function. Much as we like many fruits, the plant did not produce the fruit simply for us to enjoy. The seeds are the important part of the fruit to the plant, for from the seeds, new plants like the old one will grow. Life will be passed along to another generation. When we carry a fruit away to eat it and throw away the seeds, it may be that they will fall in a better place to grow than they would have had under the tree. In this way, the fruit may help the seeds. A complete flower is one that has all of the four parts: sepals, petals, stamens, and pistil. But not all flowers are alike. Some do not have all four parts, and others have parts that look different from the way we expect them to look. It is not easy to find the sepals of a tulip, for instance, because tulip sepals and petals look exactly alike. The only way to tell sepals from petals is to see which are outside. The three which are outside are the sepals. Here is the pistil in the center of the tulip. The next circle of parts should be stamens, covered with yellow pollen. They are stamens, but here is something new. Pollen is not always yellow. In this tulip, pollen is dark purple. The tassels on corn have pollen-producing stamens, but no pistils. Wind carries the pollen to the silk, which is part of the pistil. And neither the tassels nor the silks have bright-colored petals. Sometimes what we call a flower is really many tiny flowers. In a clover blossom, each part, like the one pulled off, is a complete flower. A composite flower is made up of clusters of closely packed flowers. The daisies are composite flowers with an outside row having large petals and many inner rows having tiny petals. Each of these parts is a complete flower. The story of how plants reproduce is a story that may vary in some details from flower to flower, but in its important steps, the story is always the same. For every fruit that forms, there was once a pistil in a flower. There was also a stamen bearing pollen, either within that flower or another flower of the same kind. The pollen from the stamen was transferred to the pistil to fertilize the flower. After the petals withered or were shattered by the wind, part of the fertilized flower lived on. It lived and brought forth the fruit. Within the fruit were the seeds that would bring forth new plants in another springtime. Yes, the story of how plants reproduce is one of the most wonderful in nature, and though we cannot fully explain it, we can look forward to watching the story unfold when winter is over and the story begins again.